Good afternoon. Today's project is about encroaching forests decouple alpine butterfly population dynamics by Samires Camilla and Jennifer Prieto. Alpine meadows are decreasing due to climate warming and reduced fire frequency, allowing a process called forest encroachment. Forest encroachment is when forests begin to expand into existing habitats, causing habitat fragmentation. In alpine meadows, very specialized species live within, especially the Paranesis symmethes, which are butterflies depend on the meadows and avoid forests. They're very vulnerable to habitat fragmentation. Previous studies have shown that forest areas actually decrease butterfly dispersals. When dispersal is reduced, populations may become decoupled. Understanding how landscape structures affect population synchrony plays a role in determining a species' persistence. So the research question in our study is, how does forest encroachment into alpine meadows affect the connectivity and synchrony of alpine butterfly populations? Research believe that as the forest between the meadows increases, population synchrony and connectivity decreases. Therefore, forest encroachment will decouple population dynamics by limiting butterfly movement. So the research study was done in the Jumping Pound Ridge, Alberta, Canada, which is a mountainous area with alpine meadows and patches of forest. The species that was studied was a Paranesis symmethes, which is an alpine butterfly, and data was collected from 17 alpine meadows from 1995 to 2005, making it 11 years of intense data collection. Standardized field surveys were conducted each summer, estimating abundance at each site from one year to the other. Population analysis was done. They calculated the annual population growth rates, which was calculated from each meadow. They also calculated the population synchrony, which was measured by computing the correlation of annual growth rates between all meadows. Research used geographic data to calculate the three types of distances. The first distances is the Euclidean distance, which is a straight line distance between the meadows. The second was the distance through open meadow, which was a path, a portion of path between the meadows that was open habitat, open meadow. And the last was distance through forest, which was the path that was surrounded by the forest. Statistical analysis, especially regression analysis, was used to determine which distance best explained the change in synchrony.
In this study, researchers compared population growth rates among three different alpine meadows labeled F, G, and R. Figure 2 shows how population growth changed over time and in each meadow. Meadows F and G were separated by only 0.17 kilometers, while F and R were much more farther apart, about 1.38 kilometers. When the meadows were closer together, like F and G, their population patterns were much more synchronized. You can see in the graph that their growth rates were rising and falling almost in unison over the years. But when the meadows were farther apart and divided by more forest, their population changes became a lot less correlated. This pattern shows that the amount of forest between meadows strongly affects how connected their butterfly populations are. So usually meadows separated by smaller forest distances showed more similar growth patterns, while larger separations led to weaker correlations. So basically this means that the greater the forest separation, the less population synchrony. Over time, forest encroachment has significantly fragmented these alpine meadows. As trees continue to expand, they isolate once connected populations into smaller patches of suitable habitat. The study found that population growth was closely related to the amount of forest distance between meadows, not just the straight line distance. What this means is that it's the presence of those forest barriers rather than the distance itself that reduces synchrony between populations. Meadow pairs separated by large forest areas had lower relatedness in their population changes. So, forest distance directly influences how connected or isolated different butterfly populations become across the entire landscape. Looking at the broader meaning of these findings, it's very clear that human activity is directly tied to forest encroachment or the growth of forests. So efforts to prevent forest fires and the effects of climate change have allowed trees to spread into higher elevations and infringe on open meadow areas. Forests are often viewed as, signs of a healthy environment, but for these alpine butterflies, expanding forests actually create hostile conditions. They depend on these open meadows for food and reproduction. So when the trees take over, the butterflies end up losing their habitats. This forest growth disrupts dispersal and gene flow between populations. So when they can no longer freely move between meadows, each population becomes isolated, smaller, and weaker, more vulnerable to extinction. So these isolated groups are less genetically diverse and more likely to disappear after environmental changes or even just random events. This means that the rescue effect where individuals from strong populations can recolonize or just support weaker ones becomes less likely as the forest barriers continue to grow. So while forest expansion might seem like a natural sign of growth, in this case, it's actually breaking apart and damaging habitats by threatening the species that depend on them. So to conclude, the rising tree line is reducing species connectivity in alpine butterflies. So larger connected communities are stronger and more resilient because individuals can freely move between metals, share genes, and just recover from disturbances together. But smaller, isolated populations are a lot more at risk. When the metals become fragmented by forests, the chance of local extinction increases, so populations can no longer rely on each other for survival. So preserving these open meadows is essential to maintain things like synchrony, gene flow, and then just long-term stability of these butterflies. So it's important to note that forest encroachment isn't entirely natural. It's largely influenced by human actions, such as suppressing fires that would normally maintain these open habitats. There is, however, a positive side. So while isolation increases the risk of local extinction, it could, reduce the chance of one large-scale extinction event. But still, the overall message is clear, and that's that protecting meadow connectivity is really the key for the survival of the species of butterflies.